I'm going to talk with you about the basics of what happens to a piece of brass. Here you have a 40 cal barrel with an integrated feed ramp, and here you have a wonderfully loaded Leatherhead bullet. What happens is the bullet goes up the feed ramp into your chamber, and then your firing pin, of course, hits your primer, and then you have an explosion inside the case. What happens inside the case is it expands against your chamber wall. Chambers are different. You know, some chambers will allow more expansion than others. And then the gases and pressure push the bullet out the front of the barrel. Brass is very popular versus its counterpart of steel and aluminum because it handles that resizing and expansion very well. Once you have your piece of brass resized, you just can't load at this point. As you can see, the bullet is not going to go in fairly easy or smoothly. Basically, the Hitek coating will get scraped off if you don't have proper case flare. The most important part of the bullet is this lower area to have coating, so that's definitely not where you want to scrape it off as you try and seat that.
For example, here you can see a traditional cast bullet lube ring. These are the only parts of the bullet that actually receive any kind of lubrication to help it go through the lands and grooves.
So slowly play with your case flare as far as bringing the die adjustment further and further down until your bullet just sits in there just right. Okay, you don't want to over flare. You can over flare and it's better than under flaring. However, if you over flare, you're going to cause excessive stretching of your brass and you're going to get less reloads out of it, as you can see here. There's nothing wrong with this. You can load this just fine, and then when you get to your taper and crimp, which we'll talk about next, it'll remove that flare. However, like I said, the more you flare, the more you run the risk of overstressing your brass. I like to just do just enough that I'm not scraping, as well as I want the bullet to rest in there well. So as it's rotating around in my progressive press, it's not knocking the bullet sideways and catching me off guard when it tries to go into the seating die.
Bullet flare is really hard to kind of catch on video, so here are 3 drawings. One you can see has no flare and it's going to scrape the sides. Here you can see one that's just right. It's going to allow the bullet to go in and start to seat the rest of the way down. And then the final picture you have over case flare, which will actually be okay, but you're going to overstress your brass over time.
Before we talk about taper crimping, let me show you a piece of brass that's actually set to the amount of flare that I use. Leatherhead does a phenomenal job of baking and applying the right amount of coating onto these that I have zero issues and zero concerns about the coating coming off. As you can see, when I insert this into the piece of brass, it barely fits in there. You can see a little gap. It's not going to be scraping anything off, and it's definitely in there.
Here's where you can see the crimp area. And in the middle, you can see what's called a roll crimp. A roll crimp is where the brass is actually squeezed into the side of the bullet. This is mainly for Magnum style cartridges. Off to the right, you can see what's called a taper crimp, and that's what we're going to focus on in the next part of the video, where the brass is actually just squeezed into the side of the bullet. Here's where you really want to avoid excessive taper crimp because you'll actually squeeze it enough to where you'll resize the bullet diameter.
You can taper crimp and seat in the same station, but I highly recommend not doing that. I actually seat and then I'll crimp in the next stage. Why that's my choice is I get a lot more reliability. If I'm expecting a certain crimp diameter, I'm getting pretty close to that, if not on that, when I do it separately. When you do it in the same stage, it can be pretty finicky. You can actually have issues of over crimping, and when you have over crimping, you're actually digging into the bullet.
And when you dig into the bullet, you're resizing the diameter of it, and it's not going to contact the lands and grooves, which in turn leads to a bigger issue of leading. Everybody dreads leading. However, it can be easily avoided. With that said, don't mistake barrel fouling with leading. Barrel fouling is actually when you are not getting full ignition of all your powder, and it's basically just blowing into the barrel and looks like leading residue. One more tidbit of why I don't like seating and crimping in the same stage is the way the die works is as you're seating, it's starting to start that taper crimp, which makes it easy to over crimp.
Have the space to crimp and seat in 2 separate stages, I definitely recommend that. But the purpose of the crimp for me is to get rid of any bell that I created so I could seat the bullet, as well as remove that rough edge so I do get more reliable seating within the chamber. And here you go, 1 Leatherhead loaded round, case gauging perfectly.
Are you ready? Stand by.